All right, on Monday when we left off, we were talking about the Battle of Chickamauga, and I told you that with the Battle of Chickamauga, that the Confederacy really they messed up because they allowed the Union to retreat and regroup. Now that was an issue because it grew in size, and when they allowed them to do this, all it did was it allowed Sherman to get his men together and head south into Georgia. Now this is where we pick up with today's notes. All right, so today we're going to start with the Atlanta campaign. Well, as you can see, over the course of several months, Union General William T. Sherman worked his way toward the city of Atlanta. Now Atlanta used to be called Terminus, and we've talked about this before. They had a lot of railroads, right? And that was why the Union really wanted Atlanta. Okay, because at the time it was the heartbeat of the Confederacy. It was what made the Confederacy go. All right, because they were able to pump goods and send goods all through Atlanta and all throughout the South due to Atlanta's railroads. So if they took Atlanta, if Sherman got Atlanta, they saw it as a huge prize. So it took over 4 months for Sherman and his armies to get to Atlanta. Once Atlanta was conquered, though, it was occupied and looted by Union troops for 2 months. So they stayed in Atlanta and they burned it, and they burned it to the ground. They also looted it, so they took it for everything it had. Sherman's army then left Atlanta in flames and began a march through Georgia in November of 1864. So again, Atlanta was burned to the ground. They took everything they could from it, and they moved on after 2 months. Moving forward, Sherman now starts his what we call March to the Sea. So he went from Atlanta all the way down to Savannah. Now as he does this, he's sending his divisions out with instructions to plunder what they could. Now if you don't know what plunder means, that literally means almost like loot. Go from home to home, take whatever you can, steal it, take it, whatever they could take was theirs. So Sherman and his men went from, again, home to home, town to town, destroying and burning what they could and taking valuables. Now this, as you read this, might not sound right to you or great, but hey, you got to remember, we're at war right now. This is war. So Sherman doesn't really care. He just sees this as his time to shine. He's on his way from Atlanta to Savannah, and he is telling his men, hey, take whatever you want. Now, this path of destruction was 60 miles wide and 300 miles long. That's how long his march to the sea was. 60 miles wide and 300 miles long. Sherman and his men were met with little resistance, and they reached Savannah, and Sherman telegraphed Abraham Lincoln. So Sherman's going to let Lincoln know, hey, I have completed my march to the sea. I basically have Georgia for you, and now I am in the old city of Savannah. He presented Savannah to Lincoln as a Christmas present, and then get this, he did not destroy the city. He never messed with Savannah. He got there, but he did not destroy it. He did not burn it. He left it and said, hey, President Lincoln, this is now your city. Okay. The march to the sea ended Georgia's contribution to the war completely. You got to understand, whenever Sherman went through Georgia and essentially destroyed Georgia, that was it. It was over. Georgia could not do anything else. As a state, Georgia could not contribute any more to the war. It was out. It was down for the count. It was done. Now, my man right here, we have here, this is William T. Sherman, okay? All right, you can look at him and think of him as you may, okay? All right, I'm not sure why he has that look on his face. Maybe he's thinking about burning down Atlanta, okay? All right, you also have Sherman right here on his horse riding through Atlanta as they burn it down. And then you have another picture here of, I'm not sure what that is, maybe them taking apart the railroads. That's what I would guess that is. This looks like them taking apart railroads here. Next, the war ends. And we've kind of talked about this. Obviously, we all know that the North wins in the end. After Sherman's march to the sea in late That's supposed to say 1864. I'm not sure why it says 1964. But imagine this says 1864. The war continued on for a few more months. Eventually, without supplies and manpower, the Confederacy could no longer fight, and Robert E. Lee, we know he is the head general of the Confederate Army, he's going to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant in April of 1865 at a place called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. So the war was over and slavery ended, and now Georgia has to rebuild. Remember, Georgia was hit hard during the Civil War due to Sherman's March to the Sea. So as we move forward with Georgia, we now see that they're going to have to rebuild, and we're going to go through a whole Reconstruction period where Georgia is going to basically change and go through what we call the Reconstruction period. Andersonville. Now, we haven't talked about Andersonville a whole lot. We talked about it when we did the power previewing. Some of y'all looked at it and you're like, hey, this looks interesting. Okay, so we can talk about it now. The worst prisoner of war camp, POW camp. Remember, if you're a prisoner of war, if you're behind enemy lines and you get caught and they essentially arrest you, they send you to a POW camp, a prisoner of war camp. Well, one of the most notorious and infamous POW camps in the South for the Confederacy was in Americus, Georgia, and was called Andersonville. Okay, technically at first it was called Camp Sumter. Okay, and you can see that right here where it says Camp Sumter. That was what it was known first as, but then later it was called Andersonville. The Confederacy did not have the supplies to keep conditions in the camp sanitary. Okay, so they couldn't really keep it clean or healthy. Union soldiers died quickly in the camp from disease like typhoid and dysentery. Now, I'll talk to you about what these two words mean here later on, okay? Friday when I'm back at school. If you want to ask Miss Coleman, if you're a third period or fourth period student, ask Miss Coleman what typhoid or dysentery is. They can tell you, okay? She can tell you. And they also died from exposure. Now, we've talked about exposure before when we talked about the Trail of Tears. We know exposure is when you're in the elements, when you're outside and your body can't take maybe the cold or the heat, and your body gives in and dies. Okay, all right. It is estimated that 18,000 Union soldiers died in Andersonville. That is a lot of people. After the war, the head of the prison, Henry Wires, was executed for excessive cruelty. Okay, so this POW camp was so bad that at the end, when it all was said and done, and the Civil War was over, they executed the guy who was over it because of how bad they treated the Union soldiers who were captured and sent to this camp. Now, this is Andersonville. And you can still go visit Andersonville today in Americus. All right. Now you can see all the camps right here. Okay. This is, you can see they lived in tents. But what I really want you to focus on, guys, is right here. I want you to look at how skinny this man is right here. This is what we call malnourishment. This is where this man is not given enough food. And more than likely, he ultimately died due to exposure or some sort of disease, or maybe just not being able to get the nutrients or food that he needed. Okay, all right. Some of y'all might look at that and say, wow, that looks like a picture from the Holocaust. Well, later on in history, this is kind of the same thing. The way the prisoners at the Holocaust were treated were essentially the same way that these POWs were treated. These Union soldiers who were captured and sent to Andersonville, how they were treated as well. Okay, all right. Now, to end this whole unit of notes here, all right, just in conclusion, you got to understand the Civil War was fought between the northern United States and the southern United States. Okay, so it was North versus South, Union versus Confederacy. The Civil War was fought over slavery and issues that connected to slavery, states' rights, Compromise of 1850, nullification, the Dred Scott case, and the election of 1860 when Abraham Lincoln wins the election. Okay, But guys, remember, at the end of the day, it all revolves around slavery. Okay, it does. There's no getting around that. All right. Abolitionists, people who wanted to get rid of slavery, and former slaves fought valiantly to end slavery, sharing stories, just like the narratives we read, fighting for the Union and bringing awareness to the reality of slavery and letting people know how awful and how just horrible slaves were treated in the South. Okay, they let them know the narratives. The narratives played a big role, and we've already talked about that, right? After Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, that's when the South secedes from the Union. Okay, remember secede. To secede means to leave. When South Carolina seceded, they left the country. They were no longer a part of the United States. And that's what all the states that were in the Confederate States of America, the southern states, they all seceded. South Carolina was the first. Georgia essentially secedes in a month later, January of 1861. And war begins soon after secession. Again, this is supposed to say 1861. When they seceded, it begins in 1861, not 1961. Not sure why it says that, 1861. The Battle of Antietam led to Lincoln writing the Emancipation Proclamation. We know that is the document that freed slaves in the South if they did not surrender. We know the South does not surrender, essentially, when Lincoln says, hey, I'm writing this Emancipation Proclamation. If you will surrender now, you can keep your slaves. Well, they don't take him seriously. They don't think if Lincoln is president, they'll be able to keep their slaves, so they keep fighting. And they ultimately, we know, lose the war. They do surrender in the end, and the slaves are freed. Georgia also was annihilated in the Civil War by William T. Sherman and his March to the Sea. We just talked about that. And he starts in Atlanta and essentially destroys Atlanta. Remember, he loots and plunders. That is 60 miles wide and 300 miles long. He goes from Atlanta all the way to Savannah, but he does not destroy Savannah. Remember, he gives that to Lincoln as a gift. And in the end, the South loses the war and has to be reconstructed, because you have to understand, the South had been using people who were enslaved for so long. They were all about those plantations and relying on that for their economy. Things are going to change, and we'll talk about that in our next unit moving forward. All right. I hope you have all had a wonderful day. I hope you have enjoyed me going over this with you. Now that you are done, please start working on your study guide. Okay. And I will see you on Friday.